Today, as we come to look at the Ten Commandments, we come, of course, to consider one which I suspect for all of us, we would readily think that this couldn't possibly ever be an issue for us. Maybe a temptation at times, but I don't think it would ever strike us as being an issue for us. Because, of course, it seems so straightforward. It seems so self-evident. You shall not murder. You shall not murder. A commandment which not only is one that we would recognize and accept because of our hope and trust as Christians, but one that we know has a universal appeal. Its very rightness is so obvious. And yet the sad thing is that as we look upon our world, as we look upon our land, these are words that we need to emphasize. And not just because of the obvious reason. This morning I did a wee bit of research by clicking on the BBC News website and looking at Scotland. And there were 4 stories of murders that had taken place. One was in August. One was someone that disappeared in October from Annan. And the other 2 were situations that had happened this week. One in Inverness and one in Elgin. Not the kind of ready and rough places you would expect to read and hear of such things. And yet, that's the reality of the land we live in today. I remember as a child growing up in Govan, which is obviously not one of the most salubrious parts of Glasgow. And I remember a murder had taken place. And it was such an unusual occurrence. The police had a caravan that was set up as an incident room, even although the actual police station wasn't that far away from where these events had taken place. So unusual in the late 60s and early 70s for such a thing to happen. And yet there we have this weekend the reality of our incredibly safe country. But while we might think these are things that don't affect us, Jesus, of course, in the Sermon on the Mount goes further. We read in Matthew 5, "You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, 'Do not murder. And anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, 'Raca,' which means empty head, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, 'You fool,' will be in danger of the fire of hell." Because, of course, Jesus points not just to the act, but yes, the very thought, the very way in which we respond to those around us. Because he recognized that the reality is that when these things happen, the act is the final outcome of the attitude and of the disposition, or even the character that led to the result. But as ever, it's important for us to think, first of all, what this commandment is not actually saying. What is murder? It is, after all, an unlawful killing. Down the centuries, there are many Christians who have looked on this verse and come to the conclusion that they should be pacifists. And many have lived with the consequences of that act, because it's no easy choice to be a pacifist. But while that might be a personal response to these words, it's not actually what these words are saying. We have a right to defend ourselves, both as individuals and as a nation. And certainly as we look upon this world we live in with all its injustices, it would be incredibly foolish just to say that we don't need to defend ourselves. In fact, as you read through the rest of the law of Moses, you get to the book of Numbers, and there God gave instructions for what was called the cities of refuge. Do you know about them? It was a recognition that sometimes people were killed. In our law, we would call that culpable homicide. Not murder, but something that went wrong, where that was certainly not the intention. Not something done in anger, not something done with malice aforethought, to take lives. Murder is something quite different. But what has this got to do with us? What is it that underlines this commandment to us? Incredibly, it strikes me that it's actually more about life than about death. Because what is it that underpins this commandment? In Genesis 1, we read the account of creation. And what is recorded for us there is something that we can easily miss or neglect. It says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creation that moves along the ground." So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. What does that say to us about the place and the position of humanity? To be made in the image of God is not a physical reference. God does not have a body, not certainly until the incarnation when Christ came amongst us. Jesus tells us that God is spirit, and those who worship him worship in spirit and in truth. What is it that makes humanity different from the rest of creation? It's not just this idea of dominion or stewardship being over creation, but it's to do with who we are as individuals. Our individuality, our rationality, our creativity. All the things that make us who we are, the choices we have and the choices that we make, is what it means surely to be made in God's image. And because of that, each of us, each individual, has a worth and a value in the very fact that we are the people that we are. And despite this world we live in, despite the society at times we're a part of, it's not about wealth. It's not about status. It's not about position. But it's a value, a dignity, and a standing that comes from the very fact that each one of us, and indeed the whole of humanity, are made in the image of God. That we each have a common intrinsic value because we are each made in the image of God. And it's that that's taken away by murder. And murder is only possible when we take away that worth and that dignity in those we see around us. It only happens when, as we've seen so often in our world, even in recent days, when we dehumanize. When we dehumanize. Whether it be individuals or countries or races. When we make them less than human, that such a response is possible. I remember reading a startling fact a number of years ago that has always stuck with me. That the great impetus for the Nazis to develop their final solution of the gas chambers was not merely because it was a much more industrialized way of dealing with what they saw as being a problem of the Jewish people. It's because they recognized that the manner in which they were carrying it out previously was actually having psychological effects upon those who were carrying it out. That as depraved as they were, as hardened as they were, to be physically executing so many people was causing problems for the executioners. So even although they had dehumanized, even although they had built up this idea for over a decade that some lives were not worth living, even those who'd been exposed to that could not cope with the reality of taking lives. Because we declare on the basis of what God has done in creation that all human life is sacred and that all human life matters. Think of what we read in our newspapers and watch on the television these days. Look for those who first try to take away that dignity, who then seek to dehumanize. That then means that these lives don't matter. This is a far cry from what God has revealed in His Word. And when we accept what God has revealed in His Word, then it must affect how we view our world, how we view those around us, and yes, even how we view ourselves. Because what does this mean for us? It surely challenges our thoughts. What a world we live in, that we become so easily immune to the reality of much that happens in our world. How we are no longer shocked in the way we once were with some of the things that confront us. We become so desensitized to suffering. The pictures from Gaza, the pictures from Ukraine, the pictures from Yemen. And yes, we could go on and add so many other countries to that list. The plight of those who would take to small rubber crafts and try and cross the English Channel, or be put into old leaking fishing boats to try and cross the Mediterranean, that somehow they might come somewhere where life might be better, because their life is so miserable. And we become so readily immune to it. The problem is not the fact that these people have no life, that such dangers are worth the risk. The problem is we look at our society and wonder how we can cope with it. The fact that people have nothing, and we become increasingly immune to their plight because we lose that sensitivity to those who are made in the image of God. And actually it goes further. It goes further because we're living at a time and an age where those who seek to take their lives seems to be at an increasing number, particularly amongst young men in society. Because for them, life doesn't seem to be worth living. Because they've lost sight themselves of the fact that they are made in the image of God and they have worth. Oh, it's easy just to say there are too many people to respond to. No. We need to be those who, by the things we say and the things we do, underline the fact that we value not just those who are around us and those who are like us, but that we value everyone. The story is told of the storm that left a mass of starfish on the beach. And a child was walking along the beach, picking them up and throwing them back into the water. And of course, quite a lot of them were then washed back onto the beach. And somebody says, "You're wasting your time." And the child replied, "I wasn't wasting my time for that starfish." We can feel overwhelmed. We can feel powerless. And yes, we are. But just as we've sent these shoe boxes to children we'll never meet, and realize that through that simple act, we have impacted upon one life, how many more lives are we called to impact as we stress the value of all? As Charles Darwin produced his theory on the origins of species and recognized that in the animal kingdom there was this thing called natural selection, which in effect is a survival of the fittest. I don't believe for a minute that he recognized that humans would feel the same way. And yet how easily as a world, as a society, we have become like that. Whether it be the smallest and youngest and most vulnerable, whereby we naturally select. We screen them out so that everyone is perfect. Now, for anyone who is a child who is less than perfect, there's a huge pain and loss because of that for them, and also the grief we feel for the child. But how much they contribute to our lives as we share with those who don't quite match the perfect. And as we get to the other end of the spectrum, we know that once more there's another assisted suicide bill going through Parliament. And why is it we act against these things? Because we see everyone is made in the image of God. And I know that's a grey area and there's much confusion amongst many in society. Euthanasia, after all, the word means good death. There comes a point for all of us when we say, yes, don't give us any more treatment, don't intervene. We want good palliative care so that no one suffers. But when as a society we cross that line and say there comes a point where we will take life, then that pressure begins to rub off, where that preciousness is lost. whether it be months or weeks or days, because we say to people they don't matter. And the sad thing is there are too many countries, even countries nearby us, that people reach an age when they're scared to call for the doctor, not because they have to pay, but because they think they won't survive the visit. The survival of the fittest. After all, who wants to be a burden? But then who of us would not say we would willingly want to take and share that burden? Because those around us are those that we love and we care for, and we recognize their worth and their dignity. And so you see, incredibly, although we immediately think this is a commandment about death, it's not. It's actually about life. It's about purposefully recognizing and seeing the value and importance and the worth of all who are made in the image of God. And so, yes, it challenges us. Challenges us to what we say. Challenges us to how we react to those around us. Asks us, what signals do we send that we recognize the worth and the dignity of all? Because when we don't, we not only see a society change and attitudes change, but we change. And actually there comes a point for all of us that we don't recognize and see the dignity in ourselves. God made men and women in his own image, gave to us a worth and a value. And surely we need to cherish that, proclaim that, and seek for others to know that in this world in which we live. Let's pray together. Father, from our earliest days we have known the phrase, Jesus loves me, this I know if the Bible tells me so. We recognize it's a worth and a love that is not just for us exclusively, but is indeed for all who are made in your image. And you have called us in turn to be those who love. Forgive us for our failures to love, for our